The following podcast contains advertisements. If you prefer a podcast without advertisements, you can sign up for our ad-free version at patreon.com/lawfare. That's patreon.com/lawfare. You'll get rid of the ads, and we'll be very grateful.
Right now, our lives are on our phones. And with our phones full of live-streamed exercise classes, midday work calls, and nightly family video calls, there's no room for fraud calls. Thankfully, AT&T makes customer security a priority, helping block those pesky calls. It's not complicated. AT&T Active Armor, 24/7 proactive network security and fraud call blocking to help stop threats at no extra charge. Compatible device/service required. Visit AT&T.com/activearmor for details.
It's not like we needed to wait 2 years to see charges against Mohammed Khalifa. You know, it's been known for at least a year who he is, where he is, and what he did. There's all kinds of evidence, as Amar pointed to, potentially hundreds of hours of his voice narrating these videos. And yet no charges came from the Canadian government and no effort was made to charge him. So I find that quite striking, is that we know where he was, we knew exactly what he did, and we made no effort at all to bring him to justice. And it seems like the United States has decided to take matters into their own hands, likely because of the significance of who he was.
I'm Jacob Schulz, and this is the Lawfare Podcast, October 5th, 2021. Over the weekend, news broke about U.S. prosecutors in the Eastern District of Virginia indicting Mohammed Khalifa, a Canadian who traveled to Syria in 2013 and later joined the Islamic State, where he became the English language voice with a distinct North American accent for a series of Islamic State propaganda videos. The indictment is a big deal, both because of the person it implicates and because it's a U.S. court trying a Canadian man for crimes committed in Iraq and Syria. To break it all down, I talked with Leah West, an assistant professor of international affairs and national security law at the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs, which is a part of Carleton University in Canada, and with Amarnath Amarasingam. The two are experts on Canadian foreign fighters leaving Canada to go join the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, and they're also in the unique position of having interviewed Khalifa at a Syrian Democratic Forces prison a couple years ago. It's the Lawfare Podcast, October 5th. U.S. prosecutors indict a Canadian ISIS propagandist. Leah, get us started here. We'll talk a bit about who this person is later on, but first, tell us what happened. What's the news event?
Well, the big news is that the FBI obtained Mohammed Khalifa from Syrian custody. He was in custody of the Kurds in northeastern Syria, brought him back to the United States, where the Eastern District of Virginia has charged Mohammed Khalifa with conspiracy material support to terrorism, meaning ISIS, and he is going to face criminal prosecution in the United States. And so while that's not super unusual, the United States has gained possession and brought a number of individuals back to the United States to face prosecution. My understanding is those are typically Americans, and in this case, it's a Canadian who has been repatriated is the wrong word because he's not American, but has been brought back to the United States to face criminal prosecution for his role in supporting and facilitating the activities of ISIS.
Yeah, so we'll get back to a lot of that in a bit, but Amar, first, I'm curious to hear a bit more about who this person is. So who is this guy, and what is he and his unit known for?
So that's interesting. I mean, he's one of the few. We've had a few Canadians who've taken on kind of important media roles, but I would say he's the most important one. He was born in Saudi Arabia in 1983. He came to Canada, studied computer networking and things like that in Toronto, eventually decided to travel to Syria in, I would say, mid to late 2013. He didn't join ISIS right away at the time. He kind of jumped around a few different organizations that a lot of other foreign fighters were in. And then he joined ISIS. The first time kind of, I think the rest of us heard him or heard his voice was in the September 2014 Flames of War video. And I remember quite vividly when this video came out, telling a few people, this guy sounds like he's from Toronto. But it was kind of dismissed, or I kind of brushed it aside because it was, why would a random guy from Toronto be in such a high position in the ISIS media apparatus? But later, when Stuart Bell and I went to Syria in October 2018, I asked another fighter who was in prison at the time, and he kind of confirmed, this guy's from Toronto, and he goes by the name Abu Ridwan al-Kennedy. And so that kind of, again, I put it aside, didn't know what to do with it. And then he was eventually captured in early 2019. And then one of his friends in Toronto immediately sent me a DM on Twitter and said, I know this guy, and started talking about him. And then also mentioned that when he was in Toronto, they called him Abu Ridwan al-Kennedy, right? And so that's when kind of all these different people became the same person. But his importance is quite significant in the ISIS media apparatus because he's the voice behind Flames of War 1 and 2. He is the voice behind almost every single Al-Bayan radio broadcast that ISIS put out, which was a daily broadcast. He's also behind several kind of claims that ISIS has put out after attacks. He narrated the famous Structure of the Khilafah video, and on and on. So, we literally have dozens, if not hundreds of hours of his audio basically narrating English language ISIS propaganda.
And this will become relevant later on, but he made his way to Syria by way of Canada, is that right? Or did he leave from somewhere else?
No, he went from Toronto to Egypt. He told his mom that he was just visiting Egypt to get better at Arabic, and then traveled from Egypt to Syria and crossed over from, I think it was like the Idlib border.
Gotcha. And so you two have your own experience. Amar, you talked a bit about this, but you guys interviewed him, right, again in 2019. Talk to me a bit. I'd be curious to hear from both of you what that was like.
Yeah, I mean, he was once he was captured and we decided to go back to Syria, I mean, he was on the top of the list in terms of who we wanted to talk to. And he'd been interviewed by then and after by, lots of other Western journalists as well. But one thing, I mean, that struck me about him is he's very thoughtful, very articulate, very deliberate in kind of what he believes his role in ISIS was, why he joined. There's no sign of regret there at all. There's no sign of kind of rethinking why he joined, et cetera. And I say that because a lot of other fighters that we've talked to do have a sense of remorse, right? They've been wanting to leave for a while, especially after they had kids. But Abu Ridwan, I think, is quite unique. I mean, he was committed to the very end. And he mentioned, ISIS, as they were losing territory in 2019, basically put more importance on people like him and the media apparatus in general, because they realized that as they were losing physical territory, continuing to kind of boast about stuff through the media is going to be much more important. And so he basically went with the last holdouts, from Raqqa to Mayadeen to Baghouz, and kind of eventually decided to pick up arms and kind of fight in the last villages that were being held. But his kind of role in the final days was to kind of carry on the media releases.
And Leah, any reflections from your time with him?
When we walked in, because there were allegations at the time that he might have been the executioner in the Flames of War video, I was kind of expecting someone with a lot of bravado. And he was actually quite, like Amar said, thoughtful. I wouldn't say humble, but, not someone who kind of puffed out their chest about their role, but was very cognizant of the importance of what they did. The thing that struck me was when we talked about, because I was really interested in, did he think about the law? Did he think about consequences? I'm a legal researcher, right? Did criminal code provisions have anything to do with whether or not he thought about his choices? Did he think about the consequences? And he said no. He felt he had obligations. And when we talked about whether or not he felt he would face criminal justice, he assumed that he would. And we talked about where he thought that would be. He didn't want it to be in Canada because he wanted his wife and children to be able to join him there. And he was afraid that his wife and children would be on a no-fly list and he would be on a no-fly list. So they'd never be able to get back together whenever, this was all wrapped up. Right. And so he was still kind of not fully, I think, grasping the consequences of his actions in terms of the law. He was thinking about, once he served his sentence, whatever that would be, that he would get to live, or he was hoping to live happily ever after with his wife and children, which to me was somewhat astonishing, but may have just been, the things people have to tell themselves when they're in prison. The other thing is, people keep talking about a Canadian connection, or he's, a Canadian citizen, but from Saudi. No, he's a Canadian dude, right? Like, he grew up and went to the same high school my dad went to the same high school, he is a Toronto boy. He is not, someone who spent a little bit of time in Canada and then moved on. He is very much a Canadian. He grew up in Canada. He, made his plans in Canada. His family is still in Canada. He reached back to his mother who was there. So he's a Toronto boy who ended up in Syria and now finds himself in the Eastern District of Virginia facing criminal prosecution.
The other thing that I'll add to that is, he's absolutely, born and bred, or not born and bred, but at least, grew up in Canada, grew up in Toronto, and his radicalization period starts a bit late, right? So I think he told us it was in 2008 or something, when he was 25 that he first started to get in touch with his religious identity again, went on these online forums, started listening to the usual suspect of Anwar Awlaki, and started to think about his duty as a Muslim to go and fight on behalf of his people, etc. And so in 2008, 2009, and a few years later, he's already in Syria. And so the kind of speed at which these decisions are made is also quite interesting.
And Amar, I'm curious, you've had a lot of interaction with folks in Canada who have gone down radicalization paths. How is this guy similar or different from those folks? You mentioned the sort of lack of bravado, but other stuff that comes to mind.
I mean, I think there's several similarities in that he didn't necessarily have a rough childhood. His parents were divorced, but that's not necessarily a causal explanation for anything. But he said he grew up happy, grew up well, kind of situated in school, studied at a college in Toronto. All of that is quite common, at least amongst the Canadian cohort that have gone to Syria. It's also common that a lot of Canadians have ended up in media roles, or at least have had propaganda importance in ISIS media. You talk about Andre Poulin from Timmins, who was in one of the earliest videos that ISIS put out, saying, he was just a young kid in Toronto playing hockey and then decided that he had to go, fulfill his duty to the cause, etc. There's several Canadians who kind of were put up front by the Islamic State media apparatus as potential propaganda tools. What's kind of unique about him is his level of commitment, whereas most of the other ones that I've spoken with, and especially after their capture, were quite critical of the Islamic State, were kind of deflated as people. Muhammad Ali, for example, from Mississauga, he was just completely exhausted by the time we spoke to him in October 2018. He had several kids. He was exhausted with the drones. He was exhausted living amongst the bombs and the killings. Really wanted a kind of different life for his children. But Ridwan, or Abu Ridwan, wasn't like that. And so that was a bit of a unique aspect to him. He was quiet and thoughtful, but very much still committed to the cause and very supportive of ISIS till the very end.
So the three of us have all alluded to this, but it might be helpful especially for people who are a little bit less familiar. Leah, could you talk a little bit about the circumstances of his detention in Syria, right? So how did it come to be that he, along with a pretty significant number of other North Americans, Europeans, other foreign fighters, are in Syrian Democratic Forces allied custody?
Well, basically, as U.S. forces and Kurdish forces were retaking northeastern Syria, the fighting moved from town to town, and as they retook those towns, individuals who were continuing to fight for ISIS ultimately were captured or surrendered to either Kurdish or U.S. forces, and they were transferred into Kurdish custody. And so now there are, Amar probably knows the better number, I believe it's about 4,000 men who are imprisoned in northeastern Syria, and they continue to be held in prisons. They've not been charged with any specific offense, but essentially they were picked up on the battlefield and they remain in prison until a choice can be made with respect to whether or not they will be repatriated, where they'll face prosecution, or in the case of Mohammed Khalifa, transported to the United States. And some of them have actually started to be prosecuted. Those who are local to the region, to Syria, Iraq, face prosecution within the Kurdish justice system in northeastern Syria.
And just to foot stomp a little bit of what you're saying. So, Leah, I think we talked maybe 14 months ago. We had a big podcast in which we discussed the developments or lack thereof on this front. Do you have a sense of how much things have changed, if at all, in the last 14 months? Because as best I can tell, there's very little movement aside from a few high-profile cases, most notably the so-called Beatles who got repatriated also to the Eastern District of Virginia.
No, things have really stalled. I believe in the summer, the U.S. announced that it had repatriated all U.S. citizens that it planned to prosecute. So I guess now we're expanding to other countries.
The unplanned ones, yeah.
Yes. But otherwise, no. Repatriations typically still tend to be of women and children if they are happening. The men have largely remained in their makeshift prisons without charge. And very few states seem willing. I mean, some have, there are a few that have, but the large majority, especially of Western nations, refuse to actually prosecute, and calls from the Kurds to create some sort of international process by which other countries or international tribunal of some sort could be stood up to prosecute the men and women who remain in detention within northeastern Syria have fallen on deaf ears, and such that I think they've really stopped making them. I was communicating with members of the NES, who were trying to get trials going for 2 summers ago, and then the pandemic hit, and then it was trying to get them going for last summer, and really there's no international will to assist the Kurdish authorities in some sort of process, because there's all kinds of tricky legal issues around it. So essentially they remain jailed indefinitely I know we're not, many people won't shed a tear for them, but in really inhumane conditions, and there doesn't seem to be any progress except for the few who, like the United States, want to make the point of bringing to justice.
People who value sleep sleep on a Nectar mattress, but you're not going to believe me. After all, I might be lying. I must be lying. The only thing you know is true is that commercials lie to you. I must be lying.
Instead of believing silly commercials, trust the more than 2 million happy sleepers who sleep on a Nectar mattress. Nectar Sleep is currently running their biggest offer ever, $399 in accessories plus a 365-night home trial and free shipping and returns. Go to nectarsleep.com today.
So I think all that's probably a helpful segue to the question of what's so significant about this. Leah, you mentioned earlier, it's pretty common that we see Department of Justice press releases about various people being charged, often in the Eastern District of Virginia, with material support in connection with ISIS-related activities. But this one has gotten a bit more attention, at least is my sense. And I'm curious to hear from both of you. Do you think that's because, does it have to do with the profile of the person, or is the explanation for it having more to do with the sort of weird legal machinations going on here?
I'll let Leah take the legal question, but I think, I think partly it has to do with the profile of the person, his kind of background as voicing basically dozens and dozens of English language ISIS propaganda is one. I think the fact that a lot of Western journalists have actually spoken to him and know his story is another. There's a lot of prisoners whose story we don't know, for instance, and so that contributes to the kind of storytelling that we're seeing. And I think from a Canadian perspective, we do have several kind of dual citizens, Canadian and American citizens, who are held prisoner. But the fact that he's strictly a Canadian citizen shows that there might also be something else going on in terms of whether he had a role within ISIS that was, something that we don't know, something higher up in the actual leadership, not just in the media department. And so all of that, I think, might come out in court if it ever does go to court.
I think for me, and why I think Canadians care, because it's a Canadian, and we haven't had any Canadians who have had prominent roles in ISIS actually face criminal prosecution before, because Canada has not repatriated anyone who was detained in northeastern Syria. those who were charged early and, between 2013 and 2015 with criminal offenses related, Poulin was one that Amar mentioned, are dead. And we've had very few prosecutions in Canada of individuals who actually went abroad and actually did join ISIS and came back and have subsequently faced prosecution. Realistically, there's been one-ish of those cases that reached actual prosecution, and there's 2 pending. But the rest of our other kind of ISIS cases have all been people who attempted to leave Canada, were alleged to have attempted to leave Canada to join ISIS and didn't make it all the way there. So to actually see someone prosecuted for what they did abroad, especially when it's not shrouded in secrecy like 2 of the cases that we have that are still proceeding before the courts, it is unique. But the other thing that I think is quite remarkable here is that it's not like we needed to wait 2 years to see charges against Mohammed Khalifa. It's been known for at least a year who he is, where he is, and what he did. There's all kinds of evidence, as Amar pointed to, potentially hundreds of hours of his voice narrating these videos. And yet no charges came from the Canadian government and no effort was made to charge him. So I find that quite striking, is that we know where he was, we knew exactly what he did, and we made no effort at all to bring him to justice. And it seems like the United States has decided to take matters into their own hands, likely because of the significance of who he was.
And is that right? There was no, at least we don't have any sense of any effort on behalf of Canadian law enforcement to build a case against this guy. Is it, Leah, walk us through maybe why is that?
Actually, we do know that there was efforts to build a case against him. CBC obtained documents that said that they were prepared to lay charges. The issue is the RCMP does not want to lay charges until the individuals will be repatriated. The same is true of Muhammad Ali, who Amar also interviewed. So we know that a case has been built, but because of essentially, kind of jurisprudence related to charter rights that said, once charges are brought, you have to do everything to bring them before a court and proceed to trial in a certain amount of time. There is no political will to actually bring people back to Canada so that process can be carried through. So nobody wants to start the clock by laying a charge because they know the government will not repatriate them. And the government continues to not repatriate any Canadians except for one orphaned girl last Thanksgiving. And that is purely a political decision. So while we have the cases, they could be tried in Canada. There's a political decision to not repatriate them. So those cases never go to trial.
And let me add, I mean, we're talking, as Leah alluded to, we're talking about over 24 children as well, right? And so when I used to give interviews like this in 2019, I used to say there are 20 odd children who are under the age of 5 held in Syrian prison camps, and that's no longer true. They're all getting older in these camps, right? And so many of the, like Ridwan was captured in January 2019. We're going on 3 years now where these guys have just been sitting there, and there's been no real effort to bring them back, and that includes dozens and dozens of children as well. And the only time that any movement has been made is either this one orphan that was brought back, or when a British diplomat got involved a couple months ago and basically convinced the Kurds to let one of the other women go along with her child. And so Canadian government seems to be kind of repeatedly caught off guard by developments that are happening, which I don't think is the smart way to move ahead.
I'll just jump in quickly, and Amar probably misspoke there. It was actually a U.S. diplomat that got another Canadian child out of a camp and then subsequently got her mother out of a camp. And her mother is now sitting in Erbil because the Canadian government won't produce, her constitutional right to travel documents so that she can return to Canada. They did nothing, some suspect because of the election. So the Canadian government's response to date has been to do nothing. And it's important to note, not just that there's dozens of children. There's only 4 men.
4 Canadian men.
4 Canadian men. And so we know for sure that there are cases built against 2 of them already. One of the third being Jack Letts, who is probably well known to your listeners, who is a British jihadi Jack, who also has Canadian citizen, whose citizenship was stripped by the British. And then there's a fourth individual who we believe is quite mentally ill. And so, the equity here is that to avoid the public backlash of returning potentially 4 men, 2 of whom we know charges could be brought against, they've left dozens and dozens of Canadian children in these camps.
And Leah, to the extent that and based on, publicly available statements or things that you've heard in talking to folks about this, what's the U.S. rationale, right, for having such a relatively forward-leaning posture on repatriation question, right? The U.S. repatriates foreign fighters who have no discernible connection in the United States and tries them in U.S. courts, and also has had a generally very forward-leaning posture on getting U.S. citizens back into U.S. courts, right? And I should say it's not repatriation if they're not U.S. citizen. But I'm curious what you make of the sort of policy logic behind the U.S. position here.
I think it's a commitment to holding those who were members and supporters and advancers of the ISIS cause to justice. And there's no international will to do that. And the United States, who took an incredibly important and active role in ending ISIS control in northeastern Syria, remains committed to that cause. And I should say that the international community, including Canada, is bound by UN Security Council resolutions to do certain things to bring members of ISIS to justice. And the US is upholding that. And I would say that you could make the passive personality argument here in that the actions of Mohammed Khalifa certainly did impact Americans. It certainly did lead to the recruitment of Americans into the cause of ISIS. He called on Americans to, if they could not travel abroad, to take actions and bring attacks within the United States. He referenced with glory the killing of Americans in these videos. So arguably, his actions did seriously contribute to the injury to Americans. And so I don't think it's inappropriate here for the extension of American jurisdiction in this case. And, I applaud the United States for taking its responsibility to holding members of ISIS to justice, because domestic courts are really the only option here. And you have to bring them before a domestic court in order to do that, which a lot of countries have proven unwilling to do.
And just zooming out to other countries too, you mentioned that the United States is fairly unique in its willingness to repatriate, and that includes lots and lots of countries in Europe. So stepping back and sort of thinking about the broader picture here, you talked about the humanitarian concerns of having these people in jails that are not particularly well maintained. I'm also curious about the security concerns of the sort of stasis of where things are at. We've spoken about this a bit before on podcasts, but it might be helpful to get into some of it again here.
Yeah, sure. I think, we saw, the pandemic has confused my dating a little bit, but I think it was a year or two ago when the Turks when there was a challenge to the border from the Turkish authorities, that we had several prison breaks. We had one of the camps where a lot of these women were held. The women just left. One of the prisons where the men were also got opened, and many people left. So there's always these dangers of prison breaks, prison violence. If the Turks again decide that certain cities in Kurdish control are actually theirs, some of these cities actually contain camps and prisons as well, and so your prisoners can easily become under the control of the Turkish authorities. And so there's a lot of kind of unknowns that are at play here. And we also know that when there was a challenge by the Turks, the Kurds also relocated 100 or so of their soldiers who were guarding Al-Hol camp to the border, right? And so they're also going to do what they need to do to protect their borders as well. And so there's a lot of kind of unknowns in terms of the security of the situation, which again can all be mitigated if we just tried our own people.
And so, Leah, I have one question about the substance of the indictment itself before we move to closing thoughts here. So when I look at what's in the indictment and sort of look at the facts alleged, it seems fairly, and as you say, there are many, many clips of this person talking at length on the internet about ISIS-involved activities. And the Justice Department in general has a quite strong track record in winning these cases and getting people to plead out. What do you make of the prospects for his case, with the caveat that, this is U.S. courts, not Canadian courts?
Well, the one thing I could say about American courts instead of Canadian courts is that your terrorism prosecutions go much more smoothly. And I suspect that he will be convicted of, because there is just overwhelming evidence. Not only the fact that there's all this evidence, he told Amar and I what he did. They can go us to the stand if they want. And the interesting thing to me that was new from an evidentiary standpoint, which I hadn't heard before, was the details around his actual engagement in the conflict near the end before he was detained. It talks about his actions to try and throw grenades and take out Kurdish position, which, quite frankly, he definitely left out when he talked to us. And I think that would have been evidence that would have been obtained from Kurdish forces. So it'll be interesting to see how that becomes admitted into evidence. That would be something that I would be interested in, at least from a Canadian perspective. But the rest of the evidence collected against him is stuff that was collected from within the United States for the most part, right? They have his records of his email chats with others, including his family member back in Canada, explaining what he did and why he left. And then they have all of the recordings of what he'd done. So all of that evidence should be easily admissible. And I suspect, it would be very hard for him at this point to deny his guilt after having been so cavalier about sharing what he did with people like Amar and I.
And so to close, I'm curious to hear from both of you what you think might be the broader lesson here, right? It can be always a bit tricky to draw a bigger picture lesson from an individual case, but I think this one is certainly conducive to that. So Leah, maybe we can start with you. What's the one thing you see here as being an important thing to sort of keep in mind going forward?
I think the big picture for me is that this is, again, an example of Canada's failure to live up to its commitments with respect to ISIS and bringing those who... First, we failed in preventing Canadians like Mohammed Khalifa from traveling abroad, and then we failed to bring them to justice, even though we know exactly what they did. And that is something that we've seen repeatedly since 2013, and I think requires real reflection on the part of Canadian security services and the Justice Department. And unfortunately, I really don't think we're going to get it.
And Amar?
Don't join ISIS, I think, is a good takeaway here.
A perpetual takeaway.
Yeah, an evergreen takeaway. No, I agree with Leah. I mean, I think it's just, I find it endlessly frustrating. It's almost 2022, and we're giving the same interviews, talking about the same issues, talking about the same inaction. And, 24 Canadian kids are just getting older in these camps filled with malnutrition and acute illnesses, surviving a pandemic, and so on. And I think it's just morally reprehensible to me. And I don't know when it's going to change. We saw the election excuse come and go. We've had 2 elections since that argument was put forth, and nothing has happened since. And so I don't know how old these kids are going to be by the time we decide to actually allow them to come home.
I will just say that there is now an application for judicial review of the government's decision not to repatriate Canadians from northeastern Syria before the Federal Court of Canada, which will hopefully produce more than what we've seen in the past from the government in terms of reasons for why they haven't yet. And, if successful, the remedy that they're seeking is to force the government to take action. I think given the foreign policy nature and security nature of that question, it'll be an uphill battle. But I do look forward to seeing the government be called to account and have to put evidence forward as to why it continues to do nothing.
Super interesting. And that is all the time we have for today. Thank you both for coming on.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
The Lawfare podcast is produced in cooperation with the Brookings Institution. Your audio engineer this week was Hamza Shatu of Goat Rodeo, and the podcast is produced and edited, as always, by Jen Patiahal. Please rate and review the Lawfare podcast if you use a podcast service that allows you to do so, and if not, and even if so, please consider sharing us on Twitter or Facebook, or sending the link to a friend who might be interested. And your music, as always, is performed by Sophia Yan. Thanks for listening.
Right now, our lives are on our phones. And with our phones full of live-streamed exercise classes, midday work calls, and nightly family video calls, there's no room for fraud calls. Thankfully, AT&T makes customer security a priority, helping block those pesky calls. It's not complicated. AT&T Active Armor, 24/7 proactive network security and fraud call blocking to help stop threats at no extra charge. Compatible device/service required. Visit AT&T.com/ActiveArmor for details.